Oh, it is the sleepy end of the day and you're here to talk to me. I'm going to try to make this as engaging as I possibly can, being that it's sort of about code. And everyone probably needs way more coffee to do this, but we're going to try. So if there's a few areas here that I can zig as opposed to zag, so if one of you needs to know more or less about something, let me know and I'll go down that path and we'll see how far we get before everybody falls asleep. So anyways, yeah, this is, I wish I knew this 3 years ago. I'm Adam White. I'm the lead developer at a place called Upper Rapids that you've never heard of, and you've never heard of it because we're a tiny little web development shop. I'm based out of Niagara Falls, Ontario. I work in a company that employs less people than are in this room right now. So us being a tiny little shop is very relevant to what I'm going to talk about. Because when we started doing Drupal, we didn't stop doing Drupal, and we haven't had a lot of time to stop and breathe since we started doing Drupal. So we've just been putting out site after site after site and developing stuff. And what we've come to realize is that we weren't necessarily developing stuff that was great. We weren't necessarily developing stuff that was built in the way that it needed to be built. You see, I was a Java developer initially, and I don't know if this is a story that's similar to a lot of people's, but I fell into Drupal. We had an in-house proprietary CMS. The guy that developed that left our company. I was left holding the keys, and then I had to decide, do I learn the proprietary CMS or do I learn something that other human beings have looked at some point? And we decided that the other human beings thing was probably better because we didn't need to keep reinventing the wheel in this obscure way that was probably not really good. So we moved into Drupal and we've had to build lots and lots of stuff with it. And we would always get to these parts in presentations, and they did this in the presentation I was just in, which is just delightful, where they go like, hands up if you're a site builder, and they do that thing. I'm not going to do that because I always feel like a complete ass when I'm doing that because I'm the everything guy. And I'm a little bit embarrassed because, yeah, I'm the front end and the back end, and I'm also really the HR guy, and I take out the garbage. So I have to do all of those things. And the problem is when you have to do all of those things is you sometimes don't stop and look at the stuff you're producing and go back to the stuff you've produced years ago and figure out if this is really done in the right way, if it's really adhering to the spirit of Drupal and what we should be doing and what the platform allows for us to do. And part of the problem here is PHP. You can do whatever you want, and there's no one really stopping you, particularly when you're your own boss. So you can write completely bananas code, and no one is going to step in, especially your clients if the sites are working, and tell you that you shouldn't do that. So we had a chance to go back and actually go and look at some stuff that we had done in the past and see all the crazy things we were doing and try to correct this. So this is a screenshot, slightly anonymized, of a little app that we put together. We had a client that came in where they had a prototype of a learning web app for e-learning that they had put together. And it was a little quiz. And they had marketed this out to professional sports referees, and it asked various sports rulebook things and then graded the person taking the test on whether they knew this or that about the technical rules for volleyball. Now they came into us with an iPad app that someone had developed for this. And they said, here's this thing, but when we've actually gone and thought about this, turns out that our market for this kind of thing is all in South Africa, and they don't have iPads that they're walking around with. They need this to be on the web. So they needed a really quick and dirty prototype of this so they could go and they could show it. So us being a Drupal shop, and when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, we're like, well, we can make this with Drupal. So that's what we did at first. So we went and we made this little Drupal learning app, and it worked really well. The problem is that it was made with what I understood as being the way that you could build something like this in Drupal, which is not, in retrospect, the way that you should have built something like this. So, of course, we started looking at this by thinking about content. So, okay, each of the questions that this is going to ask you is going to be a node. So there's a bunch of content that's in there. And how do you get a list of nodes? Well, if you are in your early Drupal thing, you use views, because views make lists of things. How else would you get a list of stuff? So we would use views for something like that. And then when we had to take the scores that people had accumulated from playing this thing and put them somewhere, I still had my Java hat on. And I'm like, well, that's data. It's going to go in the database. So that's what we did. And again, it worked. But when you went back and looked at it, it was weird. So scores, we just saved them right to the database. We wrote some queries, we made a table, and we stuck those scores in the database. That's not very Drupal-y. It doesn't allow me to do a lot of interesting Drupal-related stuff or leverage other Drupal tools or modules to access that data necessarily. But hey, the data went somewhere, and that worked. And when we needed to get our list of questions, now that the actual app was using JavaScript to render out the quiz that you were in, but to actually get that list of nodes that was comprising what your quiz was, well, if views make a list and somehow code is making views, there's got to be somehow you can get the results out of the view in code. And you could do that. There's a views get view results function that you could run that would spit you out the data. Because again, in that rushing to get everything done mind, a view is a list of stuff, so that got the job done. Now, the most horrible thing happened, which is the client went out and they actually managed to sell a bunch of these things and get people interested in them. So they came back to me several years later and they said, yeah, us trying to do this as our own product didn't make any sense, but it turns out we can white label this and sell it to all these sports organizations that we have connections with. So make that happen. So we're like, whoa, we need to actually look at what we did and see if it still makes any sense. Especially since you're selling this to all sorts of markets around the world. So we went and we looked, and no, we could not take that and use it. My vision here was we were going to take this little app that we had done and make it into an install profile and install instances of it and maintain it and have one nice revision tree where we have the master copy of this software and Git somewhere and we can have all these instances. And that's great if the product wasn't made with completely weird code under the hood. So this talk is me looking at that project and deciding I have to do less weird stuff. And the less weird stuff means I have to actually deal with entities in Drupal the way that you should deal with entities in Drupal. So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. So I'm assuming that not all of you are the world's most advanced Drupal developer, because if you are and you're just writing all sorts of backend code all the time, you could probably be doing this talk. I'm sort of glad that Krell left the room because I was just going to make him do it. So you're not, so I'm going to assume that a lot of you are like me, where you have to dabble in this stuff sometimes, but you don't quite know if that's what you should be doing. So let's go back to that web app that I put together, and let's do this right. So we really need to tackle two things here. That's putting this information into the database, and then getting this information out of the database. So we're going to rebuild our quiz. The UI of the game is fine. That's done in JavaScript. That's still going to work the same. What we need to do, though, is we want the way that we're storing all that data to be done in a way that if another Drupal developer looked at it, it wouldn't make them super crazy. So before we do anything, is everybody cool with what an entity is?
No.
Is anyone not cool with what an entity is? Few of you. Okay. So when we're talking about entities here, we're talking about the abstraction of sort of a core unit of data in Drupal. So content types are entities, users are entities, a taxonomy term is an entity. We're talking about a thing that you can attach fields to. So we're going to think about it that way. You can create them programmatically. That's what we want to focus on here. So all of our questions for our quiz are entities. They're just nodes. They're a content type. We have a couple in the system. There's one called multiple choice question. There's one called true and false question. If anyone wants to know why we didn't use the quiz module for this, it's because it was not the right tool for the job. It just made sense to do this ourselves. So we need to query these entities. So in Drupal 7, they introduced something called EntityFieldQuery. This is a PHP class that you can use to quickly build lists of entities without having to write any actual SQL to dip into Drupal to get those entities out. So this is what we're going to use to talk about how we're going to get our lists of questions for our quiz. So we're avoiding views here. I'm getting away from what I was doing before, where I was spitting out the view result. And there's a bunch of reasons why I'm going to avoid views. And there are actually some reasons why it makes sense to not use views at times. First of all, the entire interaction with the list of data is happening on a programmatic level here. The web app is making a call to the system. It's getting a JSON list of information back to actually build what's in that quiz. The user never really needs to touch that stuff. So we don't need to interact with views really at all. Having to dip into views the way that I showed on that earlier slide is sort of awkward if you're just doing it in code, because that's not really what it's meant for. It increases the readability of our code to not use views completely from a programmatic level, only because, again, views was made to be used by the UI. All of its idioms and everything are meant to be understood from that. The other thing that this did was this kept this core mechanic of our system out of the user space. Someone that's an admin on the site couldn't go into views and muck with the thing that's actually generating the quiz. And I know I can keep them out of there via various permission things, but this is going to be distributed to enough people where I'm not going to be the sysadmin that we want to keep as much of that stuff out of their hands as possible. On one hand, we needed one less big module being views. And the other thing that this allowed us to do by not using views and just making our own lists is it allowed us to control our own caching. When you use something like views get view result, you're still relying on whatever caching settings are in views. Because we have different scenarios that people could be interacting with this app, some of them are coming in anonymously, some of them are logging in. By doing this strictly ourselves, we could set our own caching rules in the code as opposed to using or trying to modify whatever views was doing for it. So I'm going to walk you through some blocks of code, and I'm sorry, but there's blocks of code involved in this because we're talking about code. The highlight.js thing that Reveal is using to do the code does not allow me to highlight an individual line, so I'm going to try to point these things out to you when I can. So this is a really simple entity field query call. This is in a custom module where I've gone and I've said, I want to get a list of the 10 true-false questions from the system sorted by when they were created in descending order, I'm going to limit it to 10. So you can see here that entity field query, you instantiate that, and then you'll notice there's no semicolons on the end of any of these lines. All of the functions that you use in entity field query, they return the method, the same object that it was called on, so you can chain those things out like that. So what entity field query returns is it returns a list of all the IDs that match the query that you put in there, and it keys them off by the content type. So in this case, if I had a query that could potentially return me more than just nodes, I'm going to get something back here where I'm going to have the node and then nested in the IDs, the user nested in the IDs. Normally you're not querying between different entity types, but you absolutely could. So I'm going to break down some of the chunks that are in the entity field query here just to show you what this can do. So these two lines here that I've moved out here, these are entity conditions. So here I'm going and I'm specifying two things. First of all, which entity type do I want to query? In this case, it's node. And then which bundle. So a bundle of a entity is really different instances of that entity that are going to exist. So to put that right into site builder language, if we're talking about content types are different bundles of the node entity. So in this case, my content type is called true-false question, and my entity type is called node. So those two lines are just differentiating that. You can come up with more complex queries here. So I can say, I want to go and I want to query the nodes, but I want any nodes that happen to be of the content type true-false question and of the content type multiple choice question. There's also a property condition that shows up here. This is what allows you to query anything that's on the base table for the entity. The base table for the entity is going to include things like whether it's published or not, what the actual published date was for it, the UID of the author. This is anything that is not a field that you've added to that content type. This is any of the sort of base level things. So you could add property conditions to that as well. You can also then do field conditions. This being entity field query, you better be able to do field conditions. And you can structure field conditions according to the various scenarios you come up with that you're going to need to query them. There's a really nicely documented API for this that you can look. In this scenario here, we're looking for the field topic, which is a taxonomy term that I have attached to that node. And I want to find any topic where the topic ID comes out of this list here. This is really flexible. So I could give this a single ID. I could give that an array of IDs. You can give these queries a whole bunch of stuff. They're fairly forgiving in the amount of things that you can pass in to the entity field query. Now, the one limitation here, and this sounds confusing, is they do not allow you to mix conditions between different entity types. So what we're talking about here is, in my property condition, I'm looking for where my node status is 1, which means where my node is published. I can only query one kind of entity with a condition. I can't do two. So the one thing that I can't do in a single query is say, I would like to see everything where the node's published and the user was created after this time. Because in that case, I'm asking something of the node table and I'm asking something of the user table. This is just a limitation of the way that the entity field query works. There are some ways around this, and there are some ways to expand upon this, but all that means is that you can't write these as if you could straight SQL. It's going to stop you at some point. The trade-off that you get for abstracting yourself from writing straight SQL is that they don't just allow you to do absolutely everything in that query. So, however, you can alter the query object, this being Drupal and this being Drupal 7 in particular. There's all sorts of alter hooks that are everywhere. So you can modify what's happening before it actually gets executed. So there is this hook query alter that you can get that allows you then to modify the entity field query that you're putting together. So here's the example from our system. So on this quiz, we are randomizing the questions that you're going to get. So that means I need to randomize them before they get back to the user. In my field query, one of the things that you can do is you can chain in something called add tag. The add tag function, basically all it does is plants a little flag in your query object that then allows your code to go back and say, oh hey, if the system's trying to run any query that happens to be tagged with random, before you run the query, let's do some stuff to it. So in this case, I have my module query random, which matches up with that random alter. And then what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, we're going to run this order random function on it. You can use this kind of structure to add more complex things into your field query if you need to, but that's there. The other thing that you can do with this, and this is very useful, is you can use this kind of hook query tag alter structure to debug what you're putting together. And what that means is I can go in and I can say add tag debug. Again, it's just debug because I've called it debug. That doesn't implicitly mean anything. But then I could run my hook query alter. I can say, well, if the query has the tag debug, and if I have the devel module installed, then DPQ will print out the query object. It's like DPM. And then print that stuff out. So you can use these kind of things to actually debug what you're writing as you're doing. This got super useful once I started breaking things. Because it allowed me to go in to see what was going on. So the entity field query was useful in fixing our quiz because it allowed us to actually go in and to write a 4 or 5 line piece of code that could go in, ask my system, you know what, I need a list of nodes according to these conditions, I need them to be randomized, and I need that returned. And I could avoid using views entirely for that. I could keep the user from ever having to touch views. It was great. And it also allowed me then to go and to take those fielded entities that it's spitting me back and play with them completely within the Drupal environment, to play with them completely without having to write any sort of SQL. It allowed me to write more robust code because at that point I'm not doing any kind of SQL to actually touch those things, so I'm not doing anything that's tying me to the underlying database system. If I was going to swap out my SQL for Postgres or for some other thing that I'm going to run it on, I'm not relying on anything there. So we want to go a little bit further than this, and we actually need to set some stuff now. So we can pull our questions out of the database using the entity field query. But then we have to actually get the scores that people are doing on the quiz and put those back into the database. Now, if you remember the earlier iteration of this, I just made a table, and I was just writing SQL that put the scores into the table, which seemed all well and good, but when we actually started looking at this and said, how can this be an install profile, and how can this be something that we can support and develop and expand over time, it really seemed better to us if those scores could be entities themselves. They could be fielded things themselves. Because they would come along and we'd have these scenarios where we said, you know what, the score is great, but we really want the score to also include the time that it took for the person to take the quiz from start to finish, not just their numerical score. Well, thinking about scores as an entity, I could say, okay, I can go add some date fields to that entity and we can go from there. We wanted to be in that sort of situation where we were dealing with nice Drupal objects for this. So to do this, we needed a module. Now, the entities in Drupal 7 were added pretty late in the game to Drupal 7. So a lot of the functionality that you would need to interact with them fully just wasn't there at the start. Field query, yes, that was built in. So yes, you could get a list of them. And you could, of course, load an entity or save an entity. But to actually do anything more advanced, to be able to do revisions, to export them, or to do creation, update, destruction of entities in a way that, I guess, to me as a closet Java developer, feels very nice and object-oriented. You couldn't just do that with Drupal 7. So what you needed for that then is the entity module. What the entity module gives you is all this stuff. Plus, it gives you the entity metadata wrapper. The entity metadata wrapper is magical, and I love it, and it makes me happy whenever I see it in my code, because it means I'm not seeing the horrible other way that I would have done this. So if you do something with the entity metadata wrapper, and then you from the future comes and walks into your office and looks at your code, they will not hit you. But they could hit you if you did something the other way. And something the other way is something we've all done because it just seemed like the way to do it, which was arrays. So, of course, if you want to do any kind of programming in Drupal, you're trying to get out of the browser, out of the user space, and actually write some code. Inevitably, you're going to see these giant nested render arrays, these giant nested arrays of stuff. And initially, that's what you start programming with. That's what you start playing with because, well, they're there and you modify them and it works. But there's all sorts of problems with interacting with arrays like this. The big one is one of the things that's in the arrays is the language code of the machine. Now, if you're writing strictly English language websites, this never really seems like a problem because you just stick language none in there, or you put the string und and okay, whatever. It's just something you do. It's the hurdle that you have to jump over. Oh, I got to access some stuff. Okay, it's field this, und, and then whatever I actually want. And you never really think too much about the und. Well, the problem is that as soon as you have to go and make that into a multilingual system, that und is going to trip you up because that und is the actual language that field should be delivered in. Doing things like this hard codes that language in there, and it is bad. The other thing that's bad about this is that you have to do a lot of safety checks when you're writing code like this, because field maximum points might not be set. It might not be a required field. It might be null. And if I'm trying to jump 3 or 4 less nested array levels into it, I'm going to potentially throw a whole bunch of PHP warnings. So I have to be writing all sorts of if this is set, if the array key exists, if this, to actually get into it. The other problem with dealing with stuff like this is that you actually end up writing a lot more code than you need to do things. So the replacement for this is something called Entity Metadata Wrapper. What this allows us to do is instantiate a class here where I can say Entity Metadata Wrapper of node, and then I pass in either my NID, or depending where I am, if I have the full node object, I put that in. So if I want that maximum points value, then I can say wrapper, field maximum points, value. And it spits it out. And I'm not doing any of this horrible array stuff that looks like a mess. And there's all sorts of benefits to being able to interact with things this way. The main one here is that, let's say I just had the NID. Well, doing this, all that the system has done is gone in and looked up that value of field maximum points for that NID. I have not loaded the entire entity at that point. I'm interacting with the database less when I'm doing things this way. The other thing that you can do, and this is where the metadata wrapper gets really cool, is you can chain nested references to things. So, and that's all on me. Before that, let's talk about the multilingual thing here. That language none. Here it's just assuming it's going to be in the language that the current user is using the system with. And if it's always English, then that's fine. If I want to go and actually set something, I can do it in one of two ways. I can either say when I'm instantiating the wrapper, I'd like a node wrapper for this NID, but I always want it to be in English. Or I could leave that off and just say, you know what? In this individual time when I'm calling it, I'd like the German version of the body summary. You can see here more of the chaining. So the body has a property called summary, has something called value. You can walk into all of your entities and grab the individual bits that you need in a very elegant way, in a way that feels far more object-oriented than you can normally do in Drupal 7. The other thing, and this is the best thing in the world, is you can chain stuff together. So think about having to do something like this without the metadata wrapper. Let's say you want the email address of the author of a node. You could do node load and ID, and that gives you back your node object. And then you would do user load, the UID of the author, and that gives you back your user object. And then in your user object, you have their email. So in here, I've had to go to the database and I've had to say, load me this entire entity, and then load me this entire entity so I can get to that value. With the metadata wrapper, you can do things like just say, load me a metadata wrapper for the node. So here, all I've done is created this class. I haven't queried anything yet. And then I can say, for the node wrapper, into the author, into the mail, give me their email address. And I've only hit the database then once to do that. I have not gone and loaded all these extra options. Saving anything is actually just similar. If I wanted to go change the email address of the author of the node for whatever reason, I can just take that original wrapper and just say wrapper author mail equals whatever I want. Wrapper save goes off and saves the things that I've changed in it. So it allows you to write code that is just far more elegant than what you could.
I'm curious. So what's this is a great thing. What's the performance difference if you ever had a chance to kind of look at that between the two methods?
I haven't measured the two myself, but from what I've read about this going on, because in this case, I'm not at the start loading in all this data, it's just intelligently finding out where I need to put that one thing at the end. I'm doing less initial queries out of the database to do what I have to do. So I'm going to say it's more performant, but that said, I haven't benchmarked this, so don't quote me on that. So let's go and let's just create and populate a whole entity. You can basically interact with an entity, be it a node or a user, or in this case, a custom one, entirely with the metadata wrapper, and it feels so object-oriented. It feels so nice and sensible to what you're doing. So in this case, this is back to our quiz game. We created something called an attempt. An attempt is just an entity. Now, we could have made that manually. In this case, we used the ECK module, which allows you to create fielded entities right in the UI and export them as features and everything like that. So we created a fielded entity called attempt. An attempt gets created whenever you finish one of your quizzes. And it stores a whole bunch of stuff. So our attempt here, we used entity create. This is not part of the metadata wrapper. That's just how you would create an entity. So I created my attempt, and then I immediately stuck that attempt entity into the metadata wrapper. And then I could just go through and interact with it entirely using the wrapper. So field course, this is going to be a, that's an entity reference to a node called, or a content type called course. So we set that in ID there. Field participant, this is the person that's actually taking the course. I set that. I'm setting the start and the finish time, how many correct and incorrect. Save it. After I save it, I have access to this getIdentifier function, which then allows me to go and to take the ID that's been created in the database and do something else with it. And this all feels very nice. And when I go back and I look at code that I've written that's using the metadata wrapper here, it seems very sensible to me. And you can do all sorts of stuff with it. So I just want to show you just a few of the things here. If you're dealing with, say, nodes that have lists of items in them. So in this case, we're dealing with a node that has a field called terms, which is a taxonomy term field. It has an unlimited number of terms on it. There's two ways that I can get that stuff out of there. If I go wrapper field terms value, it's just going to spit me back an array, which I can then iterate over. Or I could just say get iterator if I don't want to just get the array directly, and I can get the same thing. As far as setting things, again, these tools are really super flexible. So if I have an array of term IDs, and I want to set them on the taxonomy term, I can go wrapper field taxonomy term set, and then pass in my IDs. Or I could stick them in this way. You can interact with this stuff in however you'd really like to interact with this stuff, and it doesn't blow up all that much on you, which is really wonderful. Except when it does. The one thing that the metadata wrapper will throw is it'll throw something called the entity metadata wrapper exception. It'll do this if you try to do something like grab a piece of data that you're expecting to be nested off something that hasn't been set. So if, for example, I have my attempt entity, which is the thing that gets created when I try to take the course. And one of my fields on there is called course, which is an entity reference to a node somewhere that I have called, which it details that individual course. If I haven't set that, then I can't go into the course and then say, oh, give me a field that's on the course node called course code, because that isn't set. So in this case, this would cause an exception, and that causes the exception, and then you have to panic and go hide in the woods, or you have to handle it somehow. If you're using the metadata wrappers, using the try-catch blocks is generally a good practice, because then you can handle anything that you're going to potentially trip over as you're going in there. The other thing that is really nice about this is that you might not know what exactly you have access to when you go and create a wrapper. The cool thing that it gives you is it gives you something called get property info. So if I've gone here and I've created an entity metadata wrapper for user with this UID, I don't necessarily know what fields user has. I don't really know what properties user has. What can I do? What can I touch? Well, if I go and I run get property info, and I say spit that into the DPM logger, you're going to get something like this, where it's going to tell you all of the things that you can access. So in this case, my user, of course, is going to have the user ID, you know, their name, their email, the stuff that's built into Drupal. That's just the properties that are on that entity. I also have a field that I created and I cleverly called custom user field. It's telling me that I can have access to that too. At any stage in the game, you can take whatever the metadata wrapper has spit you out and run get property info. And it'll tell you, you know, okay, well, you're this far into the Choose Your Own Adventure book. Here's the next set of things that you can access on this. It's quite easy to code with, because at any stage, you can just kind of stop and go, I don't know what is next, and then it'll spit it out.
So curious, what would you get when you pass an NID there? You get the entire node again or nothing?
Sorry, into here?
Yeah.
So if I created a wrapper and put in my NID, it's not giving me the fields on the node. It's not giving me the values of the fields on the node. It's giving you which fields are available and what the getter and setter are for them. So this isn't to inspect the data that's in that individual entity. It's to inspect what you could ask for.
Thanks.
So we've got this far and we've talked about these two really cool tools. We now want to talk about, did anything that I tell you, will it matter in 2 months when Drupal 8 comes out? Because that's when Drupal 8 is coming out. 6 weeks. 6 weeks? In 3 or 4 weeks when Drupal 8 comes out, are you going to need any of this stuff? So the answer is, the names of some of this stuff are going to change, but the way in which you use these tools are actually far closer to the way that things are going to work natively in Drupal 8 than otherwise. So if you're writing your Drupal 7 custom modules and everything with a whole bunch of arrays and nested arrays and all that kind of craziness right now, that's going to be a huge culture shock going into what we're doing in 8. If you're using the things like field query and metadata wrapper, you're far closer to what we're going to be using natively in 8. You're far closer to how 8's going to work out of the box with no extra modules or anything that's been added to it. So again, entities themselves were added to Drupal 7 late in the development cycle. So they were, while they are so much the focus of what we talk about when we're talking about the way that Drupal works these days, it was almost an afterthought at the time. So with 8, we've all known about entities from the start. So everything has been built in that we need to. So with 8, you're probably not going to need the entity module, which is the thing that gives you the entity metadata wrapper right now. There might be an entity module that gives you some sort of extended stuff, but it's not going to be as essential as the one is right now in 7. So entities in 8 are just typed classes. And they have, some of them have generic methods that are on them, so you can go to any entity in Drupal 8 and just say, you know, ID, and it'll just give you the ID. Different entity type specific entities, so in this case, a node is going to have certain specific methods that are going to be defined in the interfaces, so I could say any node and just say get title. And entities in Drupal 8 are completely supported by handlers. So there's a storage handler that supports loading and saving and deleting of entities, as well as revisions, translations, configurations and fields and stuff like that. So the storage handler that's sort of built into Drupal 8 is covering a lot of what the entity module does for you. And then there's other handlers that deal with some of the other things. So basically, entities in Drupal 8 are going to work exactly like you would hope they would work if, say, you were Adam, the Java developer 4 years ago, expecting to interact with object-oriented data. If I want to load my entity, I would run entity load, pass in my node ID here. And if my entity happens to have a field called the greatest band ever field, I can just go set the value to the clash, because that's right. And you can interact with things, and this syntax looks a lot like the syntax for the Entity Metadata Wrapper, and pretty much by design, because that way of accessing these things makes sense. And then entity save, and then it saves that because it's a gospel truth. The other thing here is that we don't need EntityFieldQuery anymore. There is an entity.query service that exists as part of Drupal 8. So there's a couple ways that you can instantiate this, but this is the way that they suggest it, which is, I'm pretty sure it's a dependency injection, but as far as me and Drupal 8 go, it's still very Greek to me. But in this case, I can go and I can create my entity query service, and this again will look a lot like the field query, where I can say, I would like a node where it's published, where the status is 1, where the change time has been less than the request time, where the title of a taxonomy term I have on there called cat, where the title contains the word cat, and then where my taxonomy term is on there, it includes the name cats. Like, you can go in and you can parse out all of those sort of things that you could do with EntityFieldQuery, and again, this is built right in. So with all this stuff in D8 is going to be very native. It's going to be very similar to what you're doing in 7 if you're writing your custom code using EntityFieldQuery, if you're using Entity Metadata Wrapper. So I would suggest that you do, because while it's not going to be identically syntax to what you're using in 8, it's conceptually far closer. And if you're going to be mostly writing code that exists up in just below the user space, just below what happens in the UI, adding custom features, really adding things that clients ask you to do, not doing a lot of really core development, but someone wants a strange feature that you have to come up with and there's no module that's going to do it. This is the kind of code that you're going to end up writing. So it's good practice if you're doing stuff in 7 right now to be writing a little bit more in that style, because that's the way things are going. Oh look, it's plug time. It's my job to plug stuff. We're having something up in Canada called Drupal North. Not a lot of people have heard about it yet because we haven't really publicized it. It's happening June 25th to 28th. It's in Toronto this year. It's going to be in Montreal next year, and then Ottawa the year after that. This is a regional summit, so these are intended to be bigger events than Drupal Camp Toronto, than Drupal Camp Montreal. Bad Camp is very much the model for what we're trying to put on here. We're looking for 500 plus in attendance. It's free. It's free. So there is no way to register for this yet, and a website might exist, but it hasn't been announced, so you could probably find it if you're smart.
There's another Drupal camp that same weekend that does have registration. Just saying.
Is it free?
No, it's not.
So you're going to have far more information about this thing coming out, but I thought I would use my platform here to give it a little plug. So keep an eye out for this. There's going to be a lot of noise made about it in the next little while. So that's my Drupal North slide. A few other things before we just get to some questions and stuff. There are sprints tomorrow. You should go to them. They're in the UIC Center East. There was another location that was going around for them earlier, but that is wrong. It was going around because it was built into the default slide deck and was wrong, so just a lot of people left it in there. So yeah, you guys should come out. If you don't do anything, there's still, if you've never contributed to Drupal before, there is still something that you can do to help contribute to Drupal, so we encourage you to do that. And yeah, so let's talk about entities, I guess. That was a lot of code I had to rush through, and I'm sorry about that, but all of these slides, you can find the whole deck online and walk through any of that info. Did anyone have any questions about any of this stuff?
I'm asking too many.
That's okay. You're the guy.
So when you do entity save, is it saving when you save entire node or just the field itself?
Well, in that case, if it's an entity where I've there's one where I created one here. In this case, where I went and I created it,
Right.
running the save there is going to go set all the field values for it and then save it. I don't actually have it's not giving me back my ID here until the end. It has to create the ID as it starts to save these things because these, as they get stored in the database, get keyed off to the node that they were created on. So.
Is there else any default you didn't specify here?
Sorry,
if you had a field default for a field that you didn't.
This being on the programmatic end of things, I don't really know what happened if you would go to try to save entities that had required fields that you didn't set on them. I would expect that you would be setting them. But I don't know if it would actually throw you an exception there. It might. But you have control at that point. So
my query was more of update, not necessarily create. I mean, if you do a create, obviously, it's going to fill up with everything. But when you do an update, is it going to update only that field, or it's going to update the revision ID?
Because that's the benefit of using something like this as opposed to just writing to the database yourself, is that because you're abstracted a few layers above the database and you're actually using the entity subsystem, it's going to do to the node whatever you have, whatever Drupal would do to that node if you would access it yourself. So if you go and you update a field on the node, it should be setting change the last updated time on the node. If it was, anything like that, is going to be, it's all going through Drupal's entity system, so it should be, all your T's should be crossed and your I's should be dotted, as opposed to you just kind of reaching into that individual field whatever table and just flipping a value in it, where Drupal doesn't know that you've done that. And the other reason I'm doing things like this too is that by interacting with stuff this way, you're still allowing Drupal to have any kind of hooks that might need to access that data are still going to be able to access that data. So if you have an update hook that says whenever this node changes, it has to send an email to someone and warn them that this node has changed. If you're interacting with the node this way, you're far more likely to have that email go off than if you just went into the table and started flipping switches. So,
thank you.
If I could actually just respond to your question, because I dealt with this a few weeks ago. We had a batch update a lot of more nodes, but they were entities. And we tried using entity save and then the wrapper save, but we were just changing one specific field.
Yeah.
And we didn't need to update the created time.
Yeah.
We didn't need everybody else to hook in, so we used field attach updates.
Exactly. Right.
Which basically just writes to the specific
just that table. Yeah.
So it's not a good idea to usually use that. Usually use this.
Mm-hmm.
But for performance, if you have to.
No, we have used field attach.
Yeah.
We just wanted to update something in the file system changed.
Right.
And that time you don't want to affect the update time because it's associated with the user, and the user should not know whatever happened in the action.
Okay.
I'm not going to repeat all that for the recording. But yeah, generally, you don't want to try to work around the way that Drupal is trying to do things. Interacting this way is being a little bit of a nice citizen because you're putting in things that are using Drupal's entity system in a way that's kind to other stuff that's using Drupal's entity system. Especially if you're working on a team where a project where other developers than you are going to be working on it at some point. You don't want to just be making changes that are just weird, that the world isn't going to be able to interact with or find, and someone at one point is going to have a horrible time debugging. Yeah.
Would you mind walking back through the previous slide where you had the language actually out?
Yeah. It was right. It's one of the first things. We'll get there. Condition, query. Oh, sorry. That was metadata wrapper, not the field query. All these things have similar names. It's horrible. Yeah. So there's, again, so if we look at this sort of like in three ways, if you're just accessing this stuff with the array, you have to put something in that field because you need to get past that level of nesting. So if you have a single language on your system, it's probably just a 0 that's in that field, and you're just so used to being whatever the field name is, 0, I guess, for some reason, and then whatever the actual data in that field is. Well, the I guess for some reason is the language code. So if you say nothing, it's going to use whatever language is set for the user that's there. And if you have a single language system, so if the system is just in English, then it's just always going to use the English one, and it's not something that you have to worry about. In this case here, we can access this in 2 ways, and why you'd want to access this one way or the other is entirely use case specific for you. So if we want, we can pass some options into the metadata wrappers. So I'm passing in the language code here. So in this case, I'm passing in the English language code. That means that that code that I pass in is implicitly set there on any field access that I'm doing on it. So if I passed in FR here, then I don't need to write this, but anything that I go to pull out of that entity should be giving me the French language version of that. If I just pull the language agnostic version of this, it's going to give it back to me probably in English or whatever the core language on the system is set up as. But then if for some reason I wanted to say, you know what, on this individual field instance, I want to just grab the German version of that field, but leave the whole rest of the wrapper as whatever the default is, then you can set it there. I haven't had a huge amount of reasons to make the decision to use one or the other. It depends what you're trying to do. You might, because you're...
Well, I just want to add one note. I think what it's going to do is it's actually going to read what your current session is. So if you switch languages, then it should pull the language that you're currently browsing in. So if you're...
Yeah, if you toggle the language between English and French, it's going to give you... It should give you the language that you're set to be at the time. You've done a lot more multilingual, Ryan. Like if you run into this too much.
There's so many layers of it, but ultimately if you're using the language switcher, the entity should pull whatever language you are currently looking at. So if you're looking at a German page, it's going to give you German. If you're looking at a French page, it's going to give you French.
Yeah, the alternative is that you have some custom module that you've written where you need some logic that's sitting at the top, setting a variable as to whatever the language is, and then passing that down into your nest of horrible arrays that you're walking through. But you don't want to do that. You don't have to do that. Get out of the arrays. You don't need to go there.
Actually, my question was going to be using that as a model. If you're using you have information that's even farther down, you've already run some queries, gotten some results, and you're debugging, and you're going through that using the entity metadata wrapper, do you have to, can you skip further things? Or
the language is, I'm assuming you've got it set up so that the language is being set kind of for the whole content type. But I guess if it's not, and you have some sort of setup where you just have like per field language settings, the best answer is going to be, if you need it to be a specific one, be explicit about what you set for it. But if you don't set anything, then it should be giving you the one that you have set as your current user. By going a little bit higher up in the stack of what's going on in Drupal and allowing the entity subsystem to do what it does, it should be making that decision for you unless you explicitly need to set it one or the other. The alternative is if you're just writing to arrays, then you have to make that call. All right, is that anyone else want to know anything? Drupal North? Don't go to the website, it's not launched yet. It will be on Monday, and you can go to it, but don't go to it yet. I'd love feedback on this. This was sort of a weird topic. I was trying to put it together in a way that was not for people that use this every day, but probably should. I was trying to write this for me years ago, and I was writing more horrible code, and someone should have told me this. So, I'm Adam White on Twitter or Drupal.org, and that's the joined in thing to actually rate the session. And I think that's all. So come sprint tomorrow.